Just wanted to give a brief little disclaimer. I don't consider myself an expert, but I do have a passion for personal finance. And I love to share and teach on this topic as best as I can. But I always suggest that you do your own research in general. And especially, this is important when it comes to finances. So, when people give their hot stock tips, that they might not always be so hot, just be mindful. And like I said, do your own research, even based on what I'm telling you. um, so I see wealth as a means to an end. It's not a thing that's valued or important in itself, but it's useful in helping you achieve some kind of aim. So I want you to be intentional and think about what you want to use your wealth for. Do you maybe not want to worry about money, retire early, or pay for a child's education? So think about what you want from life and use personal finance as a tool to get you where you want to be. And you can plan ahead, but things don't have to be fully hashed out and figured out all the time. You can kind of adjust as you go along in life because things change. So then think about just how financial decisions can contribute to your growth and well-being of yourself and of others. So do you know your spending habits? One thing you can do is just pull some few months of credit card transaction data, and we have a lot of data folks here at Basis that can probably help you do some analysis if you're looking to do some of that. And just think about if you're spending based on what you're seeing in your spending, is it aligning with your values and goals? And then think about like what different types of spending mediums you're using and are you using them most effectively? And so I like to do a little demonstration with a little latte on the side there, which is, let's say it costs you $5, which comes out to about $1,800 a year if you're having one every day. And that's quite a lot of money, but if that daily latte makes you happy, like go for it, right? But if your goal is to maybe go on vacation, then maybe think about do you want to be spending that $5 every day on that latte? So kind of to each their own. Just make the decisions that are best for you. It's a good quote I found from Derek Thompson that says, money is more of a vaccine than a performance enhancing drug. It can prevent a lot of misery, but it won't necessarily make you happier. So there's this big debate about like, does money make you happy? And it can contribute to happiness. And I think typically they say it kind of helps us most when we're trying to meet our basic needs. But beyond that, beyond some certain level, it might not actually bring us that much more happiness. And so just kind of think about, what your intentions are with that money and will it actually make you happier or are there other things in life that will make you happier? And then again, just using that money as a tool to get you to those goals where appropriate. Um, the study was by Daniel Kahneman about the fact that happiness only increases with income up to $75,000 a year, and then after that, the additional income doesn't impact the overall happiness. But there was also a little bit. This was slightly, I think, disproven a little bit, and there was another study that showed that this might be person dependent. So maybe for some people that additional income over 75,000 might actually make a difference. And then for some people it might not. So just a little bit of facts there about money and happiness. But yeah, start with the why. So I like to use some Reddit logic, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying this on a work meeting, but okay, so there was a Reddit post that said, I love my job, is utter BS. Financial freedom is the only thing that matters. And you can see how I highlighted there. Try to build wealth, become financially independent, and follow your passion or even profession at the times and conditions you actually want. And then the top Reddit comment was, my aunt says, working is so bad they have to pay you for it. again, this is just a little bit of a joke. Like some people love their jobs, and I think, like I said, to each their own. And I think do what makes you happy, and do what you need to do to pay the bills, and do whatever. But I just wanted to pose another perspective where some people, they like to think of money to a point of that financial independence, retire early, where you know, you can, if you had that freedom, where you could retire, you would work because you want to and not because you have to. And so in that case, basically what I'm just trying to say is that do what's best for you. And um, if you get to a point of financial independence, then you can, decide to work because it makes you happy. Um, And so I put in a little Mary Kondo, does it spark joy? Because I think this is applicable not to just clutter, but also um, life in general, and it can also apply to finances. So the method that Mary Kondo pitches is to kind of tidy by category. So be it clothes, books, papers. So you kind of do it category at a time. And then I think the beauty in this is that you can create some mental clarity and emotional well-being by clearing that clutter. And then the same can kind of apply to your finances. You can work on reducing stress of maintaining like a high status lifestyle by thinking about what things in your life spark you joy. Um, and Mary Kondo says, life truly begins only after you have put your house in order. Um, so what are some things that you can gain from financial independence and growing your wealth? You can get peace of mind, freedom, the ability to take more time off, ability to take more risks, try new things, but most importantly, invest in yourself. Um, And to grow your wealth, there's a few different things to consider. Some things like the different spending mediums you use, your credit card health, budgeting, investing, always learning more about different methods of how to do this. And then most importantly, I think, is paying yourself first and remembering to pay yourself first. So jumping into some credit card information, because credit cards are a spending medium that some people use or abuse. So some basics with credit cards is to be deliberate. Credit cards make it really easy to spend, but you should think about if when you're buying something, is it something you need or you want? And if you want it, can you afford it? And is it worth it? Um, so just some basic things is like, always pay off the balance of your credit card because this impacts your credit score, which we'll get into a little bit later. Credit cards can also earn you some rewards. Um, so it's nice because if you're already spending the money, why not earn some extra rewards? But obviously be mindful that, the credit card companies are probably collecting your personal data. So might be a little bit of a trade-off there. Um, Building up your credit history, some people might not actually know, but sometimes like your oldest credit card can actually be important because if you cancel that credit card, you might lose some history there. It's all kind of dependent on personal case, but we'll kind of get into the other credit score impact. But there's also other perks that come with credit cards, like purchase protection. So like some cards, like if you buy, let's say, like a brand new phone on that credit card, you might get some protections for the phone. Some might have like a rental car insurance. My personal favorite is like a no foreign transaction fee credit card, because that allows you to essentially not have to carry so much cash when you travel, and then you're still paying less fees for the conversions and everything. Um, and so, as I was alluding to earlier, some of the things that might impact your credit score are like your payment history, the length of your credit history, as I was alluding to, look with the first credit card could be important. The credit mix that you have, so like if you use credit cards or if you have a mortgage or the more things you have, the potentially better in terms of the representation of that credit. But also one that some people don't know is the utilization. I think it's something about you should only, let's say you have like a credit limit of like $5,000, like you shouldn't use that $5,000 every month. I think it's said you should use only about 30% of that total amount, because the credit card companies are assessing like your ability to pay that money back, and like using huge amounts of that total amount indicates that you need to borrow a lot. And so yeah, just being mindful, like you can pull your credit score using tools like Credit Karma or Mogo, and then you can kind of monitor that over time, to just make sure you're on track and being mindful of that. Next, we'll kind of jump into budgeting. Here's some more Reddit logic. So how to get rich: spend less than you make and invest the difference. So if you earn and you spend, then if you spend everything you earn, then you're broke. But if you earn and you spend less, so you have some left over to invest, and you could be rich, I hope. So there are a lot of applications that you could use to help you with this sort of budgeting, to make sure that what you're spending is less than what you're earning. But you could also just use like a basic spreadsheet where you track these things, and you could look back at your spend statements to get ideas of like different categories that you're spending in, and then how much you want to kind of spend in the future, and just being mindful and tracking that, like, so that you're not going over budget. And then one rule of thumb that people sometimes use in the personal finance world is like to allocate about 50% of your money to your needs, and 30% to your wants, and then 20% to savings. But of course, that's just a rule of thumb. Like if you live in like a high cost of living area, it might not be feasible. So, you have to assess what works for you. But the point is to try and get some amount of savings that you can invest to kind of grow your wealth for the future. And so there was this really good book called The Millionaire Mind by Thomas J. Stanley, where he goes over this concept of income statement affluent versus balance sheet affluent, which we'll get into after. The income statement affluent are the people who focus on being rich and showing that they're rich. And the whole idea is that they're kind of keeping up with the Joneses. Their neighbor gets a new car, they need to get a new car, that sort of thing. And then you have the balance sheet affluent people who really focus on what money can provide them. So they focus on growing their assets and reducing their liabilities. And that's the type of person that we should be aspiring to be, is that balance sheet affluent. And the types of habits that they have, like they like to repair items rather than buying new. They make a list before they grocery shop. They send their kids to public schools. They eat from their gardens. They pay off their mortgage early, and they drive inexpensive cars. So these are all the types of habits that these types of people have. And I think that these are admirable qualities that we can all aspire to do and be, to healthily grow our wealth. Another quote, this one is from Morgan Housel. So he wrote a famous book called The Psychology of Money. And he also has a podcast. And the most valuable personal finance is not needing to impress anyone. So the quote is this: the best measure of wealth is what you have minus what you want. By this measure, some billionaires are broke. So pay yourself first, and widen that gap between what you spend and what you earn. Both really are critical. But yeah, the more that you make, the easier it is to save, and the more substantial those savings can become. So there's I find that like frugality, that's important kind of early when you start out, but then eventually you kind of try to earn more. Like you kind of stop trying to spend less, but just try to earn more. Um, and one thing you can do to help with that is to kind of automate that saving and pay yourself first. So you can actually calculate your savings rate by just looking at your savings over your income, and that'll give you your savings rate. And the reason that I bring this up is that it based how we were talking about the balance sheet affluent and income statement affluent, those are both very different in terms of savings rate. So I'll give an example here. Let's say you earn 70,000, but you're saving 21,000. That's a savings rate of 30%. Like that's a pretty high savings rate. But then you could have a person who earns 250,000, so significantly more, but they're spending, 37,500. And so their savings rate is 15%. And so by comparison, there's a big difference in both of those. And over time, so that's savings rate is a metric that you can actually track over the course of your career. And it can actually reduce the amount of time that you spend needing to work until retirement, because if you can increase your savings rate, even if you're in a lower income, over time that will make a significant difference. Um, and and yeah, I think it's a good metric to track over time to just be able to see like even just how what was your income like at this age and what were your savings like, and then just keeping track of all that somewhere, I think is useful. Um, yeah, get your in order. Um, so a few things in terms of like getting your finances in order are having an emergency fund. Thinking about what your career goals are. So your income might change over time, as we were talking about. You might want to set up some calendar reminders for yourself for various things related to your finances, or life in general, and set some time for reflection. And I put health as kind of the biggest one here because I think you have to really try to be holistic. Health, like for example, we'll get into this a bit later, but there is a lot of emotion involved with investing, and I think in order to deal with all that, you need to have good health and monitor that stuff. And just again, like I wrote their calendar reminders because even for basic things like getting your blood checked, or just like mental health related stuff, like you can make sure of all this stuff holistically, that everything's in order such that you actually have the mental capacity to think about your finances in the first place. Um, and then once things are in order, it's much easier to kind of take a step back from actively being involved. And then that will kind of allow you for just more peace in the long term. So we were talking about that emergency fund. So it's generally recommended like keeping about 3 to 6 months of your expenses. So if you're budgeting, this is easy. You'll know exactly how much you need each month. And so you can calculate about 3 to 6 months is roughly how much you would want to keep in HISA is a high interest savings account. So there's various banks, like here in Canada. I know we have a mix of Canadians and US and other potentially on the call, but in Canada we have banks like EQ Bank and Tangerine, for example, that often have high interest savings accounts. Sometimes they do promotional interest. So you can kind of monitor and see if there's different accounts providing higher interest at certain times. And this will give you, that financial security in those tough times. Like if you think about what happened during COVID, a lot of people, were losing their jobs, and this is the type of thing that would help ensure that you're ready for these types of challenges that sometimes happen in life. So yeah, it's just the basic thing that I think we all kind of need to think about and get set up with. Another thing I wanted to touch on was that liquidity, like in even for example in tough times, if you have cash, so as I mentioned, the high interest savings account, like that's an example of, something that's liquid. You already have that available. If on the opposite end of the spectrum, for example, you had a house that was your only, source of monetary value, and you actually you needed the cash to just get by day to day. Like it's very difficult to convert that to cash. And of course it's a spectrum. Um, so next to cash, you have stocks. Stocks are pretty easily convertible to cash because you just have to sell them. We'll kind of get into stocks and bonds and what all that is. But again, real estate is the one that's hard to convert because it takes time to sell a house, um, and you probably, if you were in a rush, you probably wouldn't get as much for it as you would if you weren't in a rush. So that's another reason that makes it like liquid. Um, and then we were talking about income and how you can increase your income. So again, this is an important part when to increase your savings rate. You can increase your income, which you can do by like a few various things like negotiating a pay raise, switching jobs, changing careers, or maybe even starting a side hustle. But it's just important to think about that over the course of your career. And then with your income, you can calculate actually, sorry, not with your income, with your assets and your liability. So your income allows you to acquire assets and pay off your liabilities. So assets would be like your house, or what you have in your savings account, and your liabilities would be any debts that you have, like for example, car loans or your student loans. And then by using this metric, you can, you can find your net worth by subtracting the liabilities from your assets, but it's something that you could also track over time, just like your savings rate. And that will help guide you over the course of your life, how well you're doing financially. It's just a good indicator of that financial health and helps you track that progress. And then to guide you in actually in keeping money in the right places, you can do some sheltering. So, okay, this is Canadian. Maybe someone can help me out for the US folks on the call. I know we did this last time where someone threw in the equivalents. Like as an example, I think an RRSP is like a 401k in the States. But essentially the concepts are similar. You can use sheltering to kind of help you protect your money, mostly from tax. So as an example, in Canada, we have the tax-free savings account where you're investing your post-tax dollars. So to keep in mind, like you've already paid tax on that money because you earned income, you've paid the tax on that income, and then as soon as you put it into your tax-free savings account, you can invest it. You can put it in like a regular savings account, or you can invest it in like, for example, the stock market. But in both cases, you have post-tax money that you're using. Whereas in like a retirement RRSP account, you're actually investing your pre-tax dollars. So uh, you're actually reducing your taxable income for the year. And that gives you an edge when you invest that money because you actually have more money to invest, which will eventually get taxed. In this case, it would get taxed in retirement. But it's just something to keep in mind when you're deciding of like how to allocate your money into which accounts, and just like using these different types of sheltering is like very beneficial, but they all have their own kind of rules. So at the bottom, I wrote here, for example, contribution limits. Every account might have some different limits that you need to be mindful of. Matching. So, for example, Basis is doing matching for the RRSP, the retirement account, an equivalent in the US. And then what you invest in may differ by each account type, but generally speaking, like you can invest in various different things. So some people would think, for example, a tax-free savings account, like you can only have a savings account that gives you, like 2% interest, but that's actually not the case. You can invest in stocks, you can invest in a variety of different things within that tax-free savings account. And then in Canada, this was pretty recently introduced within the last couple of years on the first home savings account. And that is similar where you're investing that pre-tax money. Um, so again, you kind of get that edge where you had to pay less tax, which means you can invest more. And then the RESP is like for education. This is for if you have kids. And again, that one is taxed on withdrawal. So kind of just paying attention to the different types of accounts, the limits, the types of matching, and how the taxes work and what you invest in each of these accounts. It's it's a little bit complicated, but it could be simple as well if if you do just a little bit of research. Um, so is this investing? You'll hear a lot of things, especially on the internet, and Reddit too. Things like buy weed stocks or buy GameStop, buy Bitcoin, buy NFTs, like whatever happened to NFTs anyways. Um, but yeah, GameStop, like that was a whole big thing. There's so much out there and a lot of it is hype. And I'm not saying that you can't get lucky because you can, but you could also get lucky at the casino. I see that as gambling and not investing. Um, it's very high risk and high variability. These things are changing a lot over time. But what I would have to say is that, for example, a lot of people do believe in the real value of Bitcoin in the long term. And so potentially you might want to have like a small amount of your portfolio allocated to something like Bitcoin. But yeah, you have to just be mindful of all the things that you want to invest in, and then just remember that people out there are saying all kinds of things, and some of it might just be hype. So be careful. Um, in today's markets, or how was it phrased on the calendar invite? Things are a little crazy nowadays, with everything going on in the world. But in a way, that's nothing new. Things like that have happened in the past. Maybe not the exact same things, but the point of it is that investing is about time in the market, not timing the market. So I'm looking at you, Melody. We were just having this conversation earlier about, there's a dip in the market, let's say right now, and should you sell things off or should you buy or whatever it is. And so one of the ways that, as I was saying earlier, there are a lot of emotions involved with investing. And if you're thinking long term, then all of that kind of becomes just noise and things that you can tune out. And that's why, in a sense, it's good to just think long term and invest, you know, certain amounts of money. You could even set up automatic payments where you're, putting the same amount monthly, uh, or biweekly, like it could be based on your paycheck. If you're budgeting correctly and you know how much you can invest, then you can, contribute the same amounts equally, and over time. Things kind of average out. And then that way you're not, having a whole bunch of brain drain trying to decide like when should I add money into the markets. You're pretty much just always doing that. And essentially you can lose out a lot of money, because like one example of something that's happened in the past is um, you might have a market dip, where people maybe sold off, but then the markets recover, but they recovered so quickly that people didn't even have time to get back into the market, so they essentially missed out on the recovery. So the point is like you can't really know the bottoms. You could try to take advantage of the low points when possible, but what you really don't want to do is, sell off at the peaks. You might not know that they're peaks, but people sometimes panic and they think, oh, things are just going way downhill. I'm just gonna, sell off, and then they'll eventually learn a hard lesson of I should have just waited and looked and thought more long term. So here's a good example of how, if you look at things, so the first chart shows returns charted daily. The second one shows weekly, and the third one shows yearly. And what you can see is that in the daily one, things look super noisy, like they're coming up and down, up and down. Even in the weekly one, it looks like that. But if you look at the last one, it kind of helps you zoom out to see that over time, things are going up and to the right. For the most part, that's how the stock market goes. And if you're thinking long term enough, that's how it should go, because essentially the stock market is a whole bunch of companies that are hopefully being productive. And if you stick to the fundamentals and think long term that things will do well over time, then it helps you to tune out that first and second chart and just focus a little bit more on that last one where there's not so much noise. And so again, here are just some more diagrams to show the emotions associated with investing. So you can see how at the top you have the point of maximum risk, euphoria, because that's when things are the best. That's when people think, oh, things are going so well. Let me invest all my money. But if you already had your money invested, you wouldn't really have to worry about that. And then at the bottom, you have the point of maximum opportunity, the depression, where theoretically, if you added all your money at that point, it would be a good thing because the markets could recover. But essentially, you, instead of worrying about these ups and downs, just if you're thinking long term, you don't have to go through all these crazy emotions. And hopefully you can do a better job of just tuning things out a little bit more. And that top right chart kind of just shows how there could be that behavior gap of like what you what your returns would be if you weren't getting involved with all the emotions and you weren't getting too involved with the markets and trying to time everything. So Albert Einstein is a pretty smart guy, and he said compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it, and he who doesn't pays it. So what is compound interest? Basically, if you take money and you invest it and it earns interest, you're actually earning money not just on the original money that you earned, but also on that interest. And it might seem small at first, right? Like think about just like a basic savings account that has like, I don't know, 0.5% of interest. It seems small, but over time it adds up. Those small amounts actually can be significant, and even more so when you're investing in things like the stock market, as opposed to just like basic savings account. But basically, like the money that earns interest can now earn more interest, and in the long term, that can be very significant. So the longer term that you think, the better. And yeah, Morgan Housel again, a quote that he's from him: average performance sustained for an above average period of time leads to extraordinary performance. So this is true not just in investing, but careers, relationships, and parenting. So yeah, it shows also that investing is not isolated from day-to-day life. It's very similar to other things in life. So okay, yeah. So when it comes to investing, you have to kind of understand your risk tolerance, which has a lot of factors. Like For example, time, we've already talked about your time horizon, and the longer the better, but of course it's personally dependent based on where you are at in your life. But this can help you kind of decide on different asset classes that you pick. Um, and if you know all your goals and your comfort level with those emotions we were talking about when it comes to investing, basically what you can do is you can find an online assessment for risk tolerance when it comes to investing, and that will help you determine essentially how much risk you can handle, because if you panic, that might lead to poor decisions. And so maybe your comfort level is not it's not too high, and it's good to know that because everyone is different. Some people can take on more risk, but some people just cannot, and they'll be up all night thinking about how poorly their investments are doing, and it's not worth it for your health to have to go through all that. If you can't stomach those types of large swings in the markets, then you're probably better off not being in the markets to begin with, and there's other alternatives. Um, so yeah, in general though, I think it helps to diversify into different asset classes. So even if, let's say, you do want to invest in stocks, you might want to hold some cash, or you might want to have a little bit of real estate, and maybe some Bitcoin. I would probably say do not allocate, what is that, like a quarter to jewelry? I don't know where this diagram came from, but yeah, let's just say that's gold, but that seems like a large amount. I don't know. To each their own again. Fine art, exactly. Um, Basically, there's a lot of different asset types. There's also different geographies that you can invest in. So even, for example, in stocks alone, you might have Canadian markets, you have US markets, you have international markets. So that also allows you to diversify to different areas. And the point is that you don't really want to put all your eggs into one basket, which is why I have that little basket there. But yeah, so deciding how you allocate, that's all up to you. You can also do some research online to find, what these allocations should look like depending on, your personal situation. Um, but we'll get into a little bit uh, how essentially like other asset classes can help, like index funds or ETFs, to help you kind of get that diversification. And we'll kind of get into that. But first, I'll talk a little bit about stock picking, which, okay, so stocks are basically you're owning a part of a company, right? So if I were to buy Amazon stock today, I demonstrated here with that little, you can see the NASDAQ AMZN. So Amazon is traded on the NASDAQ, and Amazon, essentially what I wanted to demonstrate here was that when you're picking stocks, you're actually foregoing all the other options. So as an example here, Amazon, let's just say Amazon returned 20% over the course of the year, but Shopify actually returned 40% over the course of that same year. So anytime that you're choosing a stock, you're actually foregoing investing in other stocks or in other assets. And I think a lot of people forget about that because they fixate on one particular thing. They're like, "Oh, I, made X amount of return on this stock." But maybe the market did better as a whole. And so there's that opportunity cost when it comes to picking something specific. Um, and in this case, Amazon is an example of a company that I believe they do not pay a dividend. So I just wanted to touch on what is a capital gain versus a dividend. So when I was saying Amazon appreciated, let's say by 20% in a year, that would be considered a capital gain. but it's only a capital gain if you actually bought and sold the stock, right? So I don't know, as an example, let's say the stock was $500 and you sold it at $700, then that capital gain was $200. Um, but if you didn't sell the stock, you didn't actually make a capital gain. Um, so some people talk about stocks as if they've made a whole bunch of money, but in reality, they haven't actually sold anything, so they haven't really made that money until hypothetically they've actually sold it. But another way that you can earn money in the stock market is through dividends. So in the example I gave with Amazon, I believe they do not pay a dividend. But if they did pay a dividend, then they would be paying out um, some kind of distribution. It could be, let's say, quarterly. It could be monthly. It just depends on the company. But that is the company deciding to pay out some kind of distribution. And that's a decision that the company makes. It's a strategic decision. Because some companies, instead of paying dividends, they will actually reinvest their profits, and they'll try to make more returns on those profits. So kind of like when we were talking about compound interest, it would be kind of similar. Instead of actually getting that payout, the company is reinvesting in the company to make more money, which can compound over time. And then, so companies that pay dividends, they might actually not make as much capital gains because they chose to pay out that money to their shareholders instead of keeping that money and trying to do more productive things with that money. And so essentially what I want to say is just be mindful of the types of stocks that you're looking at, because just because they pay a dividend doesn't mean it's necessarily a better stock. And there's different tax implication when it comes to, growth versus dividends. And then if you hold or you sell, and then what you can do, you can reinvest. If you do get paid dividends, you also have the option to reinvest it in that same company. So that'd be kind of like, in a way, reinvesting as if the company were not paying you out. But you would reinvest by essentially buying more shares in that same company. And then to kind of, instead of stock picking, there's other options that you can use. So a mutual fund, for example, I'm going to equate this to like a professional chef who is actually deciding on the variety of slices. So they're deciding on what stocks that they're going to pick. And then you have index funds, which are kind of like the mutual funds, but instead of a chef that's picking the slices, you actually get a pre-made combination. And then an ETF, which is actually kind of like an index fund where you have that pre-made combination, but you actually have the option to buy and sell it throughout the day. Whereas the index fund, it's just traded, I think it's daily. So with all these options, you might have different fees, but one thing that's kind of important to highlight here is like active management versus passive management. Active management, you actually have a manager that's kind of they're picking those stocks. So kind of where I gave that example with Amazon, where you were foregoing all those other stock options, that fund manager is actually deciding which stocks to pick, which may be good and bad. We'll get into that a bit on the next slide. But then you also have passively managed funds. So those index funds or ETFs are examples where they would be kind of passively managed because they're just following some kind of combination of stocks. But all these options kind of make things easier because you can choose to get a whole combination of stocks instead of trying to pick and choose certain stocks that you think might do well. So using those three examples from before, in the mutual fund, so the S&P 500 is, the 500 biggest companies in the US. And there's the S&P 500, uh, sorry. So basically you can, like, from all those 500 companies, like you might have a mutual fund manager who, let's say, picked 20 of those companies and invested in those 20. And what they're hoping to do is outperform the market. So they're trying to outperform the S&P 500 by picking, let's say, 20 of the companies that they think will do better than the overall S&P 500. But it was actually shown that only about 8.2% of mutual fund managers actually outperformed the S&P 500 in the past 20 years, which means, over 90% of these fund managers are not actually beating the benchmark of, you would have been better off in that case just investing in the S&P 500 as a whole, unless you were lucky enough to pick the 8.2% of fund managers that actually beat the market. And with that came extra fees that you had to pay for because you actually had that person picking those 20 stocks. So you're not only are you potentially not outperforming the market, you're also paying additional fees for that. So in the other two examples, if you had an index fund or an ETF, you could be passively following that S&P 500. And an example of that as an ETF here, on the side where you see the iShares Core S&P 500 Index ETF. So you can see there how it says TSE. So TSE stands for the Toronto Stock Exchange. So this one it's essentially an ETF that's traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And the ticker is that XSP that you see beside the TSE there. So XSP is the stock ticker. So kind of actually, if I go back to my example with Amazon, when you had AMZN, that's how you know you're looking at Amazon stock based on that stock ticker. It's like that abbreviation of usually the company name. But essentially ETFs, they also have that stock ticker. In this case, it's XSP. So if you're actually interested in purchasing these ETFs, they trade just like a stock would. You just have to know the right ticker for it in order to find it. And so there's actually there's ETFs actually that they have a lot of coverage of a variety of different things. And here are some examples. So based on like your risk tolerance, you might want to decide how much stocks versus bonds you want to hold. So essentially, like, bonds are considered safer. And so if you have 100% stocks, you're essentially taking on more risk. But depending on where you're at in life, typically if you have like a long time horizon, you might want to go with a higher percentage of stocks versus more bonds. But essentially, these are just examples where you actually have these ETFs that they basically do it all for you. So you can, just through purchasing one ETF, you can get a variety of allocations of stocks, depending on what is underlying within that particular ETF. And you can find all that information online by searching for them. There's a lot of different companies actually that have these kind of ETFs. Like, as an example, BlackRock or Vanguard, those are some common ones that have these types of funds where they have a variety of allocations based on stocks versus bonds. But one thing that you'd want to look for is the fees that are involved. So they have what's called an MER, a management expense ratio, which in the case of some of these funds, like you can see, the last two, they both have an 80-20 allocation, but one of them has a 0.2% fee and one of them has a 0.24% fee, which seems like a very, very small difference. But in general, it's important to keep in mind fees can actually have a pretty big impact over time. So here's just a demonstration where you you had some amount of money you invested, and then over time, that fee actually led to like a $30,000 difference in the returns of the portfolio. Again, this is going to be specific based on how much you invest and the actual fees involved. But just to show that over time it can make an impact. And then there's also other types of investing. So I just threw some examples here from Wealthsimple, where they have, for example, like a socially responsible portfolio. And then they also have private credit and private equity. Those are just some other options, which I would urge you to research if that's something that's of interest. But you could also find ETFs that follow like a specific sector. So as an example here, you have an ETF called XIT, which is the Information and Technology ETF. So by just buying one ETF, that's in this case a sector specific one, you can actually it gives you a breakdown. When you look up this ETF online, you can find a lot of facts about what's underlying it. And it'll tell you, for example, the top 10 holdings. You can see there's like a Constellation Software, Shopify, CGI, and it tells you how much percent is allocated to each of those. So these are the individual companies underlying this particular fund. And so again, you just do lots of research to see like what is the coverage of these types of ETFs, and that should all be online. And so I'm just going to go through quickly the steps that would be involved. So first, you kind of want to decide on your asset classes. As we were talking about, you might have stocks, bonds, cash, real estate, whatever. You have to decide on that. And then if you're buying stocks, you can decide if you want to go with a bank or a brokerage. In Canada, we have, Questrade, Wealthsimple, Interactive Brokers. These are all examples of brokerages. There's different ones in the States. But then you can decide on which accounts that you want to open, like as an example, that tax-free savings account we were talking about. And then after, within that account, you can buy the shares in the appropriate accounts. So I'll give you a step-by-step example where Wealthsimple is my brokerage. I want to invest aggressively to retire early. So I open a tax-free savings account in Wealthsimple. I have $500 to invest. So I add it to my tax-free savings account. Because I double checked and I still have contribution room in my tax-free savings account. And so I search for VGRO. So that's the stock ticker of the ETF that I've decided that I want to purchase. This one, as an example, was an 80-20 mix between stocks and bonds, which I thought was appropriate for me. And so I go ahead and I purchase. So to calculate how many shares that I can buy, I take my $500 and I divide that by the price of the current share price. And I'm getting approximately 13 shares. And so I can go ahead and search for VGRO and I can purchase those 13 shares. And then it's easy, I hope. We're almost at time, I think. So I'm just gonna try to wrap up really quickly and fly through the next couple slides. Basically, a lot of people ask about housing and if they should buy or rent or own. And it's a highly personal decision with a lot of personal factors. But I'm just touching on this because it's a different type of investment and one that many people have to make in their life. And so some things to just keep in mind when it comes to housing or real estate is that there are a few other things involved outside of personal factors like leverage, where you're typically borrowing money in the form of a mortgage to buy a house, which can actually be a good thing and it could also be a bad thing. So you're investing a lot more money because you're borrowing that money. But in the case of, for example, the 2008 crisis, that that leverage was actually not was not actually a good thing in a way. Um, and so you just have to be careful when you're investing borrowed money, and when purchasing real estate, you usually are. Um, and then other factors like exposure, like you might be investing in certain funds that already have exposure to real estate. So be mindful of that. Again, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. So if you're just buying one house, that's all your money, then you're overexposed. And then also the liquidity. And then so I just quickly, depending on the life stage you're at, you might be in a phase where you're actually trying to accumulate money versus where you're at a point where you're actually just trying to protect your wealth, and then eventually maybe transferring. So being mindful of kind of where you're at in life, you can kind of determine what decisions to make, like if you want to be concentrated or diversified or anything else. So sorry, I had to blow through the last little bit. Um, Thank you for growing your wealth with me. I know we didn't have time for questions. I apologize. So send them over in the chat. And yes, thank you.